Welcome everybody to our third event for the year for the doctoral lecture series. We are so honored today to have with us planning royalty, Dr. June Manning Thomas. It is an honor to have her with us, and just a little bit about the doctoral lecture series. We started the doctoral lecture series as a way to expose our doctoral students to the most prominent thinkers in the various areas that we focus on in the Wilder School. So each year we have we invite four scholars, one from Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, one from Urban Planning, one from Criminal Justice, and one from Public Administration. Today we have Dr. Thomas, who will represent the field of urban planning. This year we chose to focus our doctoral lecture series on the theme of racial justice and racial equity. And so all of our speakers this year, their scholarship and work focuses on that theme. And so we're excited today to have one of the experts, or the expert in planning, on racial equity and all things equity and about race across the country, and particularly some of June's work has focused on Detroit. So we will be giving a fuller introduction in a few minutes. The way that this will work is Dr. Thomas will give her lecture, and you can type questions into the chat, and then we'll have a question and answer session. But before I introduce our speaker for today, I wanted to give our Dean, Susan Gooden, an opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Elsie. Dr. Thomas, welcome. I want to extend the warmest welcome possible on behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. And as Elsie has said, we are indeed honored that you are a part of our lecture series this year, and we very much look forward to your lecture. I apologize in advance that I'm going to have to leave a few minutes early before it ends, but I wanted to tell you thank you for being with us. Part of this is also part of the Wilder School has a racial equity action plan called REAP, where we are being very intentional and looking inward in terms of how we can be part of the solution toward racial equity in terms of research, teaching, service, community engagement, and in outreach with our alums. So thank you so much for being a part of our series and a part of our overall efforts in this regard. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Gooden. And so to introduce our speaker, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Dr. June Manning Thomas. She is the Centennial Professor Emerita of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, where she's also the Mary Frances Berry Distinguished University Professor of Urban Planning. In 2003, she was inducted as a fellow in the American Institute of Certified Planning. She also served as president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning from 2013 to 2015. Dr. Thomas writes about diversification of the planning profession, planning theory, and social equity in neighborhoods and urban revitalization. Her recent research explored the relationship between the concept of social equity and civil rights and the civil rights movement, and examined the land use reaction of community organizations to vacant land in Detroit. She has several books, which include Urban Planning and the African American Community in the Shadows, which is a co-edited volume, Redevelopment and Race, Planning a Finer City in Post-War Detroit, Planning Progress, Lessons from Shogi Effendi, I hope I pronounced that right, a co-edited volume, The City After Abandonment, another co-edited volume, Mapping Detroit, Evolving Land Use Patterns and Connections. She is recipient of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning 1999 Paul Davidoff Award for her book, Redevelopment and Race. And she was formerly a professor at Michigan State University, where she developed a statewide initiative to link urban planning services on campus with community development needs in Michigan cities. I also want to add that she was a major part, a core part of the founding of the Planners of Color Interest Group. Dr. Thomas received her Ph.D. in urban and regional planning from the University of Michigan, and I personally consider her a friend and a mentor. So with that, Dr. Thomas.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well. First, I have to apologize. Number one, I will not be able to live up to whatever billing Elsie has given me, so apologies for that. And second of all, I do have allergies, and so I may cough occasionally. I find in this era, people get very disturbed by coughs because they're wondering if you're testing positive or something, but I just apologize for the hoarseness. Of the approaches to take today, I thought I'd take mainly a discursive approach and just talk about some of the ethical issues that confront all of us, rather than talking about any one research project and rather than talking about just urban planning, actually. So I basically have put some concepts down on the PowerPoint, but it's really in the hopes that this will stir some thinking and some discussion in the form of questions, in the form of conversation, and that my biggest hope is that you will take some of the ideas that we explore this morning and consider them in your own work, whether in the classroom or in your own research. That would be the highest honor, to think that you signed off and did not just forget everything, but began to think about the implications for your own work. So I've designed it with that in mind. So I talk about ethics. So what is ethics? Well, there are many complicated definitions of what ethics are. And I don't want to get into complications, whether we're talking about, is it Rawlsian theory or what are the different philosophical bases? I prefer today to just take the perspective of Heather Campbell, who's a planning researcher in the UK, who has written quite a lot about ethics. And her simplest definition is that ethics is what ought to be done, the question of what ought to be done. In any given situation, how should we act? How should we configure ourselves? How should we carry out our work? So it's about making choices and practical judgment. And so we're going to be in situations where they're having to be made decisions, and those decisions will determine where we go next in terms of our profession or in terms of our day-to-day activities, in terms of our research. So when I refer to ethics, it's really this broader idea of what should be done, what ought to be done. So she also points out that ethical debates usually unfurl in areas where simple distinctions between good and bad or right and wrong are not so easily solved. When you have situations where there's more uncertainty than certainty, then that's a typical ethical dilemma. So these surround us every day. This isn't something that confronts just planners or just policy analysts, public policy analysts, or public administration experts, or whatever your field might be. The easy dilemmas might be, should I obey the law? So that's kind of easy because in most cases, not all cases, you would just say, well, yes, of course I should obey the law. So that's not something that is really very difficult to consider. Middling, should I risk my job to reveal the truth about an injustice? That's something that's a little bit more difficult. That's the kind of dilemma that often faces people who are working in conflictual situations, of whether that conflict is because of nationality, nationalism, sectarian conflict, religious conflict. We have researchers that have done quite a lot of work on that in various contexts. And for example, Northern Ireland, in South Africa, in the Middle East, in the United States. Should I risk my job to reveal the truth about an injustice? Should I speak out when I see an injustice? And then there are even more difficult ethical dilemmas, such as how can I live and work in comfort when so much injustice surrounds me? So that's the idea of what should we do about a situation that surrounds us that is rife with injustice. This is the situation that faces us in terms of race. What are the dilemmas that face me as I try to carry out my work in a situation when I see that there are major, major problems that exist in society around me? So this is one of those very difficult dilemmas that I think faces us when we consider race. For researchers, let's take it down to researchers. One of the ways we might think about this is, how do I situate my work in a context of widespread racial injustice? What kind of work do I do? If I'm doing work that does look at racial injustice, then what do I do about that work? So what do I do about this actually has several meanings. If you're in a situation where you're doing ordinary research or ordinary writing, when I say ordinary, I mean mainstream, and it is not confronting racial injustice, is that an ethical dilemma? Is that something we should be thinking about this? So what do you do about that? And let's say you are doing work that is looking at some of the ethical dilemmas that face us, particularly in terms of race. Then what do you do with that work once you get it done? What do you do with that research? What are the implications of, for example, unveiling ethical dilemmas or unveiling racial injustice and then not doing anything about it? So this is a situation, a concept that I've been thinking about for some time. I'd say most of my career, I've been wrestling with this issue of what is just, how does race fit into this? What are the implications for what we should be doing? So and I cannot tell you that I've resolved this. So I've been thinking about this all my career and still it's not resolved. I'm still writing and thinking about this. Today, I'd like to just frame this a little bit in terms of questions. So the questions are, what are the racial challenges that face urban professionals and researchers? And I'm going to go through that very quickly because I'm sure you have other speakers that have talked about that. And in this day and age, I don't think there's anyone who's on Zoom right now who does not know about the racial challenges. So I'm assuming there is some common knowledge about what those challenges are. But still, I'll go through just a few lists of what those entail. Again, the talk is not trying to persuade you that racial challenges exist, but just remind you. Then second, how well are we preparing public policy researchers for the ethical dimensions of such challenges? That's actually the heart of what I'm trying to do here, is to help us to think about how our research, whether in urban planning or in criminal justice or in public policy or public administration, how do we prepare ourselves? How do we prepare our researchers, our doctoral students, for ethical dimensions, particularly of racial challenges? then how well does training prepare practitioner professionals? And so this would be, how well are we preparing people that we expect to go and actually work in the world? So that would be our undergraduates, our master's students. What can we do to help them? What are we doing to help them? What should we be doing to help them? So it all boils down to, what should we do about this? And again, I have no easy answers. I'm so sorry. You know, if you thought perhaps that all this would lead to like a list of easy solutions, my goal is to just to present these dilemmas to you and to offer some suggestions for thinking about what you should consider in the future. But these are the main questions that I'm dealing with today. So the racial challenges, again, I didn't spend a lot of time with these. I think we know that some of the racial challenges include segregation. This is just a quick image of the just Black-white dissimilarity as a measure of segregation. This basically is something that we see has continued, particularly in major metropolitan areas. This particular image shows Detroit, Newark, New York. It's fallen in some smaller metropolitan areas, but on the whole, we've seen the tenacity of this segregation that exists. And of course, associated with that is an array of other issues. But first, just to acknowledge, we're dealing with a highly segmented environment. And we can see this, so much of my work has been studying how this is the case in Detroit. This is from the Anti-Discrimination Center, which shows even in 2016, continued bifurcation by race. The darker the red, the higher the percentage of Blacks who live within a particular census tract. And the deeper the blue, the higher percentage of whites. And this is not new. We've seen this over some period of time. And then, of course, we have Hispanic enclave as well. And then, you know, of course, that there are certain organizations that have provided maps. This is the source for that particular map. This is the Washington, D.C. area. So we can see the segmentation. If we go to, there's several sites, but this is one of my favorite ones, antibiaslaw.com, to show us the segmentation that exists throughout the country. We can look at specific areas and see that this exists. Well, segmentation is not in itself bad. You know, for example, there are such things as ethnic enclaves. The dilemma we face, of course, is that the segmentation that exists is not voluntary, and it is not something that gives equal access to public services and to the necessities of life for all people. And so it's actually a reflection of the deep divisions within our society. And again, I'm going through this quickly, assuming that you know this. I didn't feel it necessary for me to prove this to you. If you do need to have this proved, I'd say there needs to be a separate conversation when someone who can help with that over a long period of time can demonstrate to you the social and racial inequalities, but I'm assuming that most people understand that and understand the implications of that. I have, as I've mentioned, I won't talk about all of my work, but Elsie did mention some of my work. This is just one of my books, which essentially has helped me to try to illuminate the existence of racial discrimination in a context in which planners were working, and the implications of the existence of racial discrimination. And so this work first came out in 1997. It was reissued in 2013. It's among my most highly cited work, which surprises me. I thought by this time we would have much more work like this and that this would not be unique. Unfortunately, we still don't know this for all metropolitan areas. We still don't understand exactly what were the racial dimensions of decisions for redevelopment and for planning over a period of time. So we still have a few case studies that show that, but we still don't quite understand all dimensions of how this racial bifurcation, and not just bifurcation, but oppression as well, has affected people that we work with as planners or as public policy advocates. But this is just one example of the kind of work that has been done in the past, looking at, for example, what does this mean in terms of the history of public housing? What does this mean in terms of neighborhoods? How have some policies been oppressive in terms of highway policy or in terms of urban renewal? But we know, of course, that challenges are much more complex than just that. So we have challenges in terms of continued poverty, in terms of racial concentration, and then other spheres. I know that you have someone who comes and talks about criminal justice. That's a field in and of itself. Employment, Elsie, of course, Hopper Anderson can tell us much about that, and workforce training. We have people who specialize in health and education. And then we're seeing even more challenges now. Of course, with COVID, we're seeing the disjuncture of even the vaccination rates. We're seeing the uneven rates of death. We're now having to wait to see what the aftermath of this is. But we know that the people losing their jobs, the people who are most likely to not have employment to go back to, are minority race people, people who were already mired in poverty, minority ethnicities. So things are getting worse in that way rather than better. And then we have reinvigorated reactionary politics, divisions, including by race. So, for example, some of us were unfortunately lured into a false sense of optimism. I know I was somewhat, particularly when I saw the reactions to the George Floyd killing and the people that arose all over the country to protest this, to march in response to this. I was very heartened to see that those protests included Blacks and whites. It was not just Black people. I almost felt as if whites were protecting Blacks. That we didn't have to have just Black Lives Matter marches anymore. And then, of course, we see the counterpoint, which is January 6th. And so we see hordes of people, white supremacists, Proud Boys, et cetera, battering down the walls of the Capitol, smashing windows, just for those of us who were lulled into a sense of comfort, just to help us understand that this issue still exists, that these divisions are still there. And I think even more disturbing to me than the people who are actually attacking the Capitol were the hordes of people that backed them, that said, well, it's okay. You know, we're just protesting. We're expressing our First Amendment rights. And you have to wonder how much of that kind of reactionary politics, which picks up wide swaths of ordinary majority people, is in reaction to what they see as racial threat, in reaction to what they see as the threat of too much government assistance for people of color, of too many Black politicians, of too many Black voters. The fact that there was so much reaction to those states and those cities where the vote was not as some people wished it to be, I feel gutturally that was a racial issue. So we have a complicated world that we're existing in right now. And I think it behooves us to think about what are the implications of such complications. these challenges that we face are really thoroughgoing and quite serious. What's special about racial challenges then? Well, racial challenges, they're ingrained in our psyches. It's something that is unfortunately in this culture, I won't say we're born with it because no one is born with racial identity or with racial prejudice. But by the time children are 4 or 5 years old, we've known for some time that the racism that floats freely in the society affects those children, and it affects us all. It affects us in terms of what we assume is good and bad. It affects us in terms of what we assume are worthy people for assistance as opposed to unworthy people. So it's deeply, deeply ingrained in the way we view society. This is not just true, of course, in the US, but we've had particular problems with this in the US, as have other countries for other reasons. It's based on longstanding discrimination. So the discrimination, of course, it is something that affects housing, it affects employment, it affects healthcare. It goes back. I mean, so one of the things we do, those of us who write about this subject, is and other people who write about this subject, such as the recent book, The Color of Law, is we go back and we look at how did the FHA affect what we're seeing now in terms of access to housing mortgages? How did the redlining affect various people? How did the legislation, mortgage foreclosure, how did that affect different people? So there's longstanding discrimination that is piling on top of what's ingrained in our psyches, and that is contributing to what we now see as normalized. So if we aren't careful, we see the environment in which we live and in which we work and in which we research as normal. We're so used to the bifurcation. We're so used to the uneven quality of access to wealth, the uneven nature of poverty, that if we aren't careful, we see that as the normal course of things. It's now embedded in the landscape. It's embedded in political structure. It's embedded in metropolitan areas. So that's a special kind of challenge that faces us. And it is fiercely defended because of extremists, but also because of ordinary white privilege. And so not only are the Proud Boys defenders, and not only the whatever those people were, you see, we're changing our vocabulary. At one point, I didn't know what Proud Boys meant. It just, I knew about KKK and I knew about John Birch Society, but I'm a Southern girl, so I didn't know about these other kinds of things that we're having to learn this new vocabulary, QAnon and Proud Boys and these kinds of things. But also because of ordinary white privilege. So because of that, we don't always see it because some of us assume it because it's a part of what we see as the everyday nature of life. There are a couple of articles that help to shake us out of this. I'm very, just to recommend one, there's no way I'm trying to offer a bibliography, but this particular one that came out just last year in the Journal of the American Planning Association, Whiteness and Urban Planning, I think is just one example of the kind of research that's beginning to shake us out of this comfort level and to help us understand exactly how deeply, particularly my field, urban planning, is ingrained in a context, a landscape of bifurcation that has been normalized. I'm actually working on a book right now that is probably a year from being published, but it's actually a combination autobiography and history of the civil rights movement in South Carolina, where I grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And so I've been steeping myself in the last 3 years in archival research and in secondary research about racism. And it's been amazing to me how much even myself, who consider myself to be a scholar of racial division and the need for racial unity, how little I understood about institutional racism and how deeply ingrained it was in the environment in which I grew up and in which I see the evidences in terms of school systems. So I think, there are several ways that we can help ourselves to understand this idea of racial challenges, but we need to realize that this is a very deeply problematic environment for us. What's special about urban professionals in this context? Well, we work in some of the most highly charged contexts. So we're urban, either urban public policy or urban planning, or even if we don't have urban in our title, because this is an urban society, even if we're looking at international context, we're still dealing with an urbanized world. And these are the places where all of these forces come into contact with each other and cause the kinds of conflicts and ethical dilemmas that face us. So we work in these highly charged contexts, highly segregated by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, within institutional contexts that are themselves dedicated to the status quo. So not to call out any names, but I mean, I love my University of Michigan, but it's pretty much the status quo. And I think most universities are. And if we work for planning offices, or if we work even for private professionals, very few of us are working in social change organizations, or organizations that are truly deeply dedicated to social change. Although there's a place made within these institutions for such change. For example, our universities, we do create enclaves, we create little nooks that can do this kind of work. I'm sure you guys do that as well at VCU. I've been looking at some of the research that you've been doing in your own university to look at some of these issues such as rent eviction, or to look at poverty. These kinds of things help us to address these, but the university is part of the status quo. So we can't be too radical or too confrontational in terms of what we're saying. And our tools are often analytical or procedural, but the problems we face do not usually lend themselves to such tools or solutions. So those of us who've come through Ph.D. programs or are undertaking Ph.D. programs, even for our master's students, we give them technical skills in research analysis, or in regression analysis, or in GIS, or for our doctoral students in policy analysis or in critical thinking. But the problems I've just described cannot be solved by those tools. I mean, we teach them and we launch our students hoping for the best for them, but they're poorly equipped. We ourselves are poorly equipped to deal with these deeply seated dilemmas that I've just described. So this idea of researchers, how well are we preparing researchers for the ethical dimensions of such challenges? Well, I'd like to give just a couple of examples. And as it happens, I have wonderful doctoral students. Either I've served on their committees or I'm their chair. And so I'd like to discuss just 3 dissertations over the past year. All of these dissertations have been within the past year. They're not yet finished. I think one of them is pretty much finished. But I'd just like to talk about what that means. A wonderful young lady did one called The History, something like The History of Feminists. I won't give you the exact title because I don't want you to go look it up. But there's one, The History of Feminist Thought in Planning Academy, in the Planning Academy. There's another one that's very good that is probably being turned into the graduate school this week. And that's on the evolution of regionalism in metropolitan Detroit. And then another, which is the racial implications of rail transit decisions. And again, these are not exact titles. But for each of these, each of them had some implications for race. I'm finding in the past few years in our doctoral program, not most, but quite a few of the dissertations in some ways encounter the dilemma of race because it's so ingrained in our society. The young lady who started The History of Feminist Thought in the Planning Academy thought that hers was not about race. And so she identified 30 or 40 women who had worked in planning in the Planning Academy dating back to the 1970s. She interviewed them. She flew all over the country. She did wonderful work on this. And then toward the end of her data collection, she discovered there was a big difference between what the Black women were saying and what the white women were saying. She discovered that she could not ignore race because the experience of the women that she was interviewed was somehow colored by racial experience. So this is one of those situations where we must look and see that essentially whatever we're trying to do in terms of understanding injustice, at some point we have to come around to race. So she ended up pretty deeply into her dissertation, having to create a special chapter just for this, to essentially recognize that even the young women, she thought that maybe the older Black and Latino women that she interviewed would be the ones that would raise this issue, but she discovered even the young women were wrestling with this, either because of discrimination that they felt within the academy or because of difficulties having their work recognized because they were working with communities that were not accepted as legitimate planning communities or legitimate topics for planning research. The evolution of regionalism in metropolitan Detroit, that young man started out just really looking for a straightforward history of regional government. And you know, when you're on a dissertation committee, at some point you let people do what they're gonna do, you know, so he wanted to do this straightforward history. And so you support them, and yes, you look at this straightforward history of regionalism, and aha, he discovers deep into the research that you cannot look at the evolution of regionalism in metropolitan Detroit without looking at race and without understanding that much of regional history, or the lack thereof, in this metropolitan area and in most metropolitan areas is affected by this bifurcation that I talked about, or this difficulty of figuring out how to resolve these dilemmas of gross inequality. And of course, the same with this third dissertation, the racial implications of rail transit decisions. Well, he knew going in, so he had a little heads up. He knew going in that what he was looking at, but he still has dilemmas. So again, going back, remember our original definition of ethics is, what do you do about this? It's not just a simple, well, you should look at social justice. No, the ethical dilemma is, what do you do about this? When you see such deeply seated, ingrained difficulties, how do you respond to that? In what ways do they leave questions? So when you do discover and uncover and call out the racial dimensions and the racial injustice, then what questions still exist? I'd say one of the questions is, back to that first slide of ethical dilemmas, what do we do about this? You know, what do we do when we see these particular dilemmas? And then what are the implications for training ourselves as researchers? What ethical training do we receive that could allow us to handle this? Now, I put this in because you and I know that most of us, when we're training doctoral students, when we are doctoral students, when we're training researchers, the ethical training is pretty limited. We talk about human subjects. We talk about you respect the rights of individuals. We talk about you do not undertake research without making sure people understand the research that you're undertaking and their rights to not participate. That's what we consider to be ethical training. But I've just presented a whole list of broader issues, such as white privilege, such as racism ingrained in the landscape, such as entrenched poverty, concentrated poverty. So I think, again, what do we take away from this talk? Maybe we need to have a discussion about this. How can we train ourselves as researchers to confront these kinds of issues? How can we help ourselves become more agents of change rather than protectors of status quo, or even rather than proponents of understanding of inequality? What else can we do? This is something I've wrestled with as well. For example, there's one particular Detroit neighborhood I've spent a lot of time working with. This is in Northwest Detroit. And I've taken classes there. We've done the things that planning classes do. We've helped them to assess what their housing situation is. We've helped them to understand what the possibilities are for creating neighborhood plans. I've gone in with a team of researchers and we've done oral interviews in terms of how the foreclosure crisis affected them, what the possibilities are for community organization, what has worked and what has not worked in terms of community organization. It's a wonderful neighborhood. There's a picture of one of their billboards. I'm sorry, this is my own photograph before they corrected the paint job. They've now corrected the paint job, so it's not quite as frayed. But I think the picture that's on the side of the building of their CDC is a reflection of the community. They're trying to be an interracial community. They're trying to hold on to some semblance of diversity. They're trying to make sure that their neighbors are protected, that they can help each other and maintain a community. But the dilemmas are quite large. The larger, even as I did research and even as our classes undertook research, we knew that the larger conditions were daunting. We knew that they were on the edge of change because Detroit neighborhoods have changed in basically a centrifugal pattern. So the ones that were closer to the center have been worse in terms of socioeconomic ability and health, and this has moved farther and farther out, and this community was in the pathway of that change right across the border from well-to-do suburbs, which is where middle-class people are fleeing, and basically with poor public services. And so we have to deal with strategies. So what about training students? If we're this conflicted in terms of research, then what does training, how do we prepare planning students, and what are we learning about that? Here we have to recognize the situated background of our students, and ourselves. So they tend to be higher socioeconomic status if they reach master's programs. They tend to be white. unless we're in an HBCU or have really been very diligent in terms of recruitment. And we know they will go into jobs which will be status quo jobs. So how do we deal with that? I've been thinking about this for years. I thought about how do I deal with this in the classroom? So one of the ways I've tried is to look at ethical codes. That's my latest publication, I think in 2019. I'll show you the slide on that in a minute. But we do have codes, like public administration codes has a very nice provision: strengthen social equity, treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect of individual differences, promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality. And then the planners code, we shall seek social justice. I can't tell you how many times I've used this quote in class to try to help people to understand what this concept of social justice means in a racially bifurcated society. We shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We've spent time looking at this, trying to understand this. I've spent time researching this, but the dilemma is this is a principle for planners. The last time I counted, there were 20 other principles. So it's one of many principles, and it's not obligatory. So there are also rules of conduct that are obligatory that you can actually be hauled before ethics commissions for. So it's not sufficient to help people understand how to comport themselves in this environment. This is the article I mentioned. This is one of two pieces that I've published to try to look at this concept of social responsible practice. This particular article, I was just curious, where did that quote come from? Where did that provision come from? What's the background for it? And I discovered it sort of came out of the 1960s. It came from the period of the civil rights era and the rising white consciousness, particularly by Paul Davidoff, whose picture is here, and his fellow planners, understanding racial injustice and fighting for several provisions. And one of the things that's left from that is the concept of advocacy planning. And another is several provisions of the Code of Ethics, such as that one. But as I said, I think it has helped with training students, but I still understand their situations are such that it may not be totally sufficient. So what should we do about this? I think the main thing is, first of all, understanding the racial challenges. I think if I would say anything, I've presented a lot of dilemmas, then what would I say would be the solution? Well, I think history, being well read in the history of what we're looking at, is absolutely essential. If we can do nothing else, we should do this to understand what is the background of the conditions that we're looking at. How deeply does that background go? What are the implications for contemporary society? There's a well-known researcher who told me once that every year she rereads W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, just to ground her, just to help her understand where we're coming from in terms of American society. I myself have done most of my work in planning history because I think that grounds me, that helps me understand what's going on. But then we have to also read and understand contemporary thought. So there's several books that are out right now. There's Caste, for example. I've already mentioned The Color of Law is out. They're basically white fragility is another one. I think just becoming steeped in that literature so that we can at least understand the lingo and understand the challenges that face us. Then understanding the ethical challenges, I would just say that we need to look at ethical challenges as just that. In planning, we have a small but important literature about ethical challenges. Heather Campbell's work, I think, is very interesting. Vanessa Watson has done some good work in this, somewhat Norman Krumholz, and of course, Krumholz and John Forrester's work. But I'd say you probably need to move past that to look at some of the more recent work that's been done, and then contemplate, what are we seeing? And of course, if you're listening to this and you're from another field, then what's being written in your field about ethical challenges that's beyond philosophical gobbledygook? I mean, it's really talking about, what should we do? You know, how should we carry out our research? How should we undertake understanding and acting on the social injustices that we see? Then I would say the most important thing is engaging, encountering, accompanying. So what do I mean by that? Not allowing ourselves to be in our ivory towers alone. Working with community groups, or working with advocacy organizations, or working with civil rights groups, or even simple neighborhoods, and listening to them. What are they facing? What are the things that they're confronting? What are the implications for a professional practice? What are the implications for research? How can we help them by empowering them with our own research? So looking at this as it's a challenge of communication and interaction. It's not just a challenge of thinking. It's not something we can solve by sitting in our libraries or sitting in our classrooms. It has to involve some form of engagement. And then finally, developing a moral framework for research and practice. Developing a moral framework. There's a special issue coming out pretty soon with planning theory and practice. I just finished my very short article for that. I'm not sure when it will be out in print, but several people came together to look at the issue in that special issue of secularism and religion in urban planning. What does that say in terms of morality? What does that say in terms of ethical dilemmas? And many of the thoughts I've shared with you today are ancillary to that article that I finished, I think 2 weeks ago or something, about what are these challenges and how do we start to build a moral framework for ourselves to help us understand what those challenges are and to act on those challenges. So one of the things I say in that article is sometimes we have to fall back on our own spiritual upbringing because these problems are so deep that we have to go deep into ourselves and rely on strong spiritual foundation. When I say that, it's not just religious. Some people, they find that in their religion, but we have to make sure that that religious foundation is not exclusionary and is not, it's not something that is counterproductive to a vision of a better society that is open to all. So we have to have some sort of discrimination in terms of what we capture from our religious background, and for sure not allowing prejudice, which has seeped into much religious structure, not allowing that to deter us from what we need to do to create a better world. So I think a better way to frame this is what Leonie Sandercott calls a spiritual challenge. And she did talk about that in the 2006 version of that Planning Theory and Practice journal, so I won't go into that. So I've actually talked myself into hoarseness, which means it's probably time for questions and answers. I hope that this has been helpful to just help you think about what are the challenges that face us in this time of great disunity in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, I didn't even mention political, I alluded to it. And what does that mean in terms of our research, in terms of our education, in terms of our practice?
Thank you so much, June. I really enjoyed your talk, and you hit on a lot of issues that we, as director of the PhD program, I see a lot of dissertations come through and a lot of these issues I'm grappling with as well. And I'm sure that some of our planning colleagues and colleagues in public administration and policy are grappling with as well. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. We have one question so far. Others, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have a question from Andrea Garfinkel Castro. In addition to preparing individuals for ethical action and research in the professional realm, can you please discuss what we can do to move our institutions, including educational and professional cultures, towards supporting, in caps, supporting those of us who wish to act ethically, especially in terms of racial justice?
Sure. So, so this confronted those of us in planning, in the Planning Academy. And so we actually began in early 2000, those of us who were particularly concerned about social justice issues, to talk about these things and to create an organization. So we began the conversations in 2006. We came together. I think the first meeting was in a restaurant in Kansas City. As I remember, it was like a barbecue joint or something. It was like definitely lowbrow, very humble. But we began to talk about what would that look like within the Planning Academy. And so we formed, there is within the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, there's something that's called interest group structure. And we had experience seeing that because we did have a faculty women's interest group. So we put together a proposal in 2007, sent to the board, the governing board of the Planning Academy, asking to form an organization. We called it the Planners of Color Interest Group. Elsie is very much aware of that history. That Planners of Color Interest Group, we elected our first president in, our co-chairs, I'm sorry, in 2008. I was very happy to be a part of creating that organization and to be the first, one of the two first co-chairs. And we developed an agenda. What's the agenda for social change within the Planning Academy? We started off by with a mentoring program. One of the basic challenges that we were facing, it was actually more than a challenge, it was a crisis. We had junior faculty of color that weren't getting, not just not getting tenure, they weren't even getting reappointed. So the first thing we did was to look at mentoring programs, but since then, FACIP, which is its acronym, has moved on to looking at pipeline initiatives. What are pipeline initiatives? What are the efforts that are necessary in terms of accreditation? So I think really getting together with like-minded individuals and looking at that as a long project. So what have I described? Well, it started in 2006. As of 2020, it's now a well-developed organization within the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. It's now tackled a major initiative, which is helping to rewrite the accreditation requirements for planning schools. And I think it's going to have impact. So I think, although I didn't talk about that specifically, organizing with others. I think most of us are trained to work as individuals, maybe in small research teams at most, but for making institutional change, you usually need a cadre of people who come together and who work on a specific agenda over a period of time. So I hope that answers.
Do we have other questions? I can't see you all, so somebody is doing something like raising their hand. I can't have you all on my screen at the same time. Okay, so I will ask a question. You mentioned that that our students and as researchers, we're poorly equipped to deal with race. How do we equip them to deal with these racial issues? What is it that we need to do to equip? And I'm particularly speaking about the PhD students. How do we, what do we need to give them to have them be ready and to have them be in a place where they're conscious of the dynamics of race that come into play in their topics that they're addressing?
Yeah, so I think one way that that we're kind of doing, I suspect your program is doing as well, is basically just what we expect people to read. So we really can't train people who can function in a bifurcated and conflictual multiracial society if they're not literate in what's going on. So we need people, we need classes, we need not just special classes, and for example, race and urban planning or race and public administration, we need to integrate the issues of racial justice and injustice within the entire curriculum in as much as possible, including the methods courses, in terms of looking, for example, at racial injustice, and certainly in the theory courses. That's actually one of the points that the Planners of Color Interest Group is making to the Planning Accreditation Board, that that kind of literacy, racial literacy, should be integrated throughout the curriculum and not isolated or segregated into one or two courses. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I've mentioned is engagement. You know, so engagement is a powerful tool. And if you give me time, I could think of more, but since I'll just say that since I'm already kind of have mentioned that. But one of the strategies that we've used for our master's students in planning here at U of M is to require them to undertake practical research with neighborhood groups in Detroit. And I'm sure you could make the translation in terms of your own environment. So when you take students into the context of deprivation, and you force them to talk to people, not force them. I mean, you don't like hold a gun to their head, but you expect them, you make it clear that you expect them to talk to people and to engage with people and to listen to them. That means so much more than just forcing them to read about them. So if you can somehow involve them in some sort of direct engagement, and I would say that's true for doctoral students as well. I mean, some sort of direct engagement. And then the step taking it farther would be some sort of engagement that is for the benefit of both. So making sure that engagement is listening to and responding to some need on the part of the population that is being engaged with. So you don't just go in and collect data, you find out what their needs are and you somewhat address those needs, but it goes both ways. You realize that you yourself are going to learn, you yourself are going to gain something just by cultural exposure and just by understanding more deeply what the situation is for that particular group of people. And I would take that a little bit farther and say you might have to be engaged for several years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't just go in and out. You know, you might have to pick certain groups, certain conversations, certain organizations, certain neighborhoods, and engage with those folks. You know, and in that way, you can begin to not create, but co-create solutions that have meaning for people. You can begin to engage in productive dialogue that can then basically help us move forward. You know, we have so many different terms in urban planning. You know, we could just have a lexicon of terms, but John Friedman used to call that transactive planning. I mean, you know, we have any kind of term you want, we have it. But I think the simple idea is how can you encounter, engage with, and help mutually a specific population of people. One of the reasons I like that approach is otherwise we get overwhelmed. You know, I was getting depressed myself giving this talk. I said, oh my God, it's so bad. But if you can pick a piece of it, you just pick a piece of it and you say, okay, I'm going to work with this neighborhood or I'm going to illuminate the problems with this mass transit in this metropolitan. You pick that piece and you figure out the organizations and the people that you should interact with for that piece. And you develop a relationship with those people in those organizations. And you build community in that way. And then you don't go crazy. I mean, you sort of, you know, here's the big old world, but here's your little piece. You want to know what the big old world is. But you don't want to get to the point that you're just so overwhelmed. You just say, there's so much that's so bad, I don't know where to go next.
Thank you. We have another question from Latoya Gray Sparks, one of our MERP students. And she says, I've heard a lot about the concept of reparative planning is what she said, to address racial injustice. Would you be able to speak to this and whether or not it is gaining momentum within the planning profession?
I don't think it's gaining momentum. Reparative justice, you know, I think it's this idea of, okay, let's think of it in this way. In the literature about justice and ethics, there's this distinction between do we look at the means or do we look at the ends? So I think much of our conversation has been about means. So we talk about fairness. If you look at the public administration code, for example, we want to make sure everyone is treated fairly. We want to make sure that people have a voice. We want people to be involved in the conversation. Okay, those are means. We want to equity planning. We want to make sure that we're keeping in mind the needs of disadvantaged people. Reparative justice is more about ends. Okay, so reparative justice is, okay, but is it now just? Have we made it just? You know, did we reach the goal? Do we now have true justice? Have the results yielded us true justice? Have we resolved the problem of unequal access to jobs, to transportation? You know, have we created a just metropolitan area where everyone has good schooling, where everyone has access to public schools? And we're so far away from that some people have said we need to figure out how to right this wrong. This wrong is so bad that we need to figure out how to right this wrong. And we're not going to be satisfied anymore with channeling the voice of this concept. We're not going to be satisfied anymore with treat us fairly. How can you treat somebody fairly when they were so disadvantaged? How can you treat communities fairly when they were so underprivileged on purpose? So I think we have to understand what that is and realize that at the end of it, we have to deal with ends. We can't just deal with means. We have to deal with ends. The problem is it's not clear how to do that yet. It's possible we will have to become even narrower in our focus in order to see anything like that happen. And when I say narrower in our focus, that's where we get things like community benefit agreements, where you say, okay, this city is not going to be just for me, but at least I want this particular development to hire my neighbors. You know what I'm saying? So that's something where you see the results. You see basically someone is actually getting jobs, but it's still far from reparative justice. It's just practice for reparative justice. And then we do the best we can through organizations, through our own efforts to prepare for that day and to keep voicing the need for that day when we really do see just ends and not just means.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I don't think I missed any of the questions. I just want to take a minute to say thank you so much for sharing this time with us and for sharing your thoughts with us. It would be, if we were in person, it'd be this time in the ceremony when I would give you a little gift and give you a hug and say thank you for being here.
You can send me some herbal tea for my throat and my allergies and all that.
We will do that. So, you know, I'm sure everyone on the call joins me in thanking you for your thoughts. And I look forward to seeing you in the future. Well, since you won't be at a conference the next time I visit Ann Arbor. So thanks again. And thank you all for joining us. And stay tuned for an announcement of the date of our next doctoral lecture. So thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.